I have observed enough power transitions to recognize the difference between control that is contested and control that is obsolete. Contested control faces challenges from competitors who dispute authority and seek to replace it with their own. Obsolete control faces something far more final. It becomes structurally irrelevant because the conditions that made control possible no longer exist. You can contest control through competition. You cannot restore obsolete control because the mechanisms through which control operated have been systematically eliminated. American control over processing of Canadian critical minerals was not contested for 80 years. It was absolute. Canadian lithium, rare earths, uranium, nickel, and cobalt extracted from Canadian territory passed through American processing facilities that transformed raw materials into valuable products. This processing control gave the United States effective authority over Canadian resource policy because Canadian materials achieved maximum value only through American transformation. The control was structural, embedded in industrial capacity that Canada did not possess, and therefore could not bypass. That control became obsolete in 2025. Not challenged, not reduced, obsolete. $280 billion systematically eliminated every mechanism through which American processing control had operated. Canadian resources no longer require American processing to achieve value. Canadian facilities perform transformations that previously occurred only in American territory. The control mechanisms that had functioned for 80 years ceased operating not because they were defeated, but because they became structurally unnecessary to Canadian resource economics. To understand why this obsolescence is permanent rather than temporary, you must first understand what control actually meant in this context. American control over processing was never about preventing Canada from building facilities. No treaties restricted Canadian industrial development. No agreements prohibited Canadian processing investment. Control operated through making Canadian processing economically irrational relative to using established American capacity. American facilities had been built over decades with massive capital investment that had been amortized through years of profitable operation. They operated at scales achieving cost efficiencies that smaller competitors could not match. They possessed technical expertise accumulated through generations of operational experience. They maintained relationships with downstream customers who had structured their supply chains around American processing reliability. Any Canadian attempt to build competing capacity would face enormous disadvantages in capital costs, operational efficiency, scale economies, and market access. This made American processing control self-sustaining without requiring active enforcement. Canadian resource companies concluded that sending materials to American facilities for processing was more economically rational than attempting to build Canadian capacity that would operate at permanent disadvantage against established American competitors. The control was automatic, maintained through the economic logic of choosing the lowest cost, highest reliability processing option, which was invariably American. Control of this kind, maintained through structural economic advantages rather than explicit authority, appears permanent because it operates through rational decision-making rather than coercion. Canadian companies chose American processing not because they were compelled, but because alternatives appeared economically irrational. This voluntary compliance based on economic logic made American control appear unbreakable because breaking it required making economically irrational investments in facilities that would lose money competing against superior American operations. Mark Carney recognized that making American control obsolete required eliminating the economic rationality that sustained it, not contesting American authority through political confrontation, not negotiating reduced American influence through diplomatic agreements, systematically eliminating every structural advantage that made American processing the economically rational choice for Canadian materials. Once those advantages disappeared, American control would become obsolete because the economic logic sustaining voluntary compliance would cease to exist. $280 billion represented investments sufficient to eliminate American structural advantages across every dimension simultaneously. Capital disadvantage was overcome through upfront funding, making Canadian facilities capital competitive with fully amortized American operations. Operational efficiency gaps were closed through recruitment of experienced processing engineers and years of operational learning. Scale disadvantages were eliminated through facilities built at sizes matching the largest American processors. Market access barriers were overcome through long-term supply agreements with downstream customers. The systematic nature of this investment was essential because addressing any single disadvantage while leaving others intact would have left American processing as the economically rational choice despite Canadian alternatives existing. Only by eliminating all disadvantages simultaneously could Canadian processing become genuinely competitive and therefore make American control obsolete rather than merely contested. Lithium processing obsolescence illustrates this comprehensive approach. For 80 years, Canadian lithium achieved maximum value by passing through American processing facilities that transformed raw ore into battery-grade compounds. American processors controlled this transformation because they operated at scales and efficiencies that made Canadian competition appear economically irrational. This control was absolute not because it was enforced, but because it was the rational economic choice given structural realities. $40 billion made this control obsolete by building Canadian lithium processing capacity at scales matching American facilities, with technical efficiency achieving parity through accelerated learning, and with customer relationships established through supply agreements that made Canadian sourcing economically attractive. The result was not contested control where Canadian processors competed unsuccessfully against superior American operations. The result was obsolete control, where Canadian processors offered economically equivalent alternatives, making American processing no longer necessary to Canadian lithium economics. When control becomes obsolete rather than contested, the psychology changes fundamentally. Contested control means choosing between a dominant option and an inferior alternative, with the inferior alternative gradually improving through competition. Obsolete control means the dominant option is no longer necessary because equivalent alternatives exist. Canadian lithium producers no longer need to consider American processing when making economic decisions because Canadian processing offers equivalent outcomes. The control that American facilities exercised through being the only rational economic choice ceased to exist because they are no longer the only rational choice. Rare earth processing obsolescence followed identical logic, but addressed even more concentrated control. American rare earth processing had been among the most technically sophisticated operations globally, separating 17 chemically similar elements to extraordinary purity levels. The technical barriers were so substantial that American facilities controlled rare earth transformation, not just through scale or cost advantages, but through possessing capabilities that very few facilities worldwide could replicate. $60 billion made this control obsolete, not by building inferior alternatives that contested American technical superiority, but by systematically matching that technical sophistication through recruitment of experienced rare earth chemists, construction of facilities with equivalent separation capabilities, and establishment of customer relationships demonstrating reliability matching American processors. The control that American facilities had exercised through unique technical capabilities became obsolete when those capabilities were no longer unique. Uranium enrichment control obsolescence addressed the most concentrated processing capability globally. Uranium enrichment requires technology subject to extraordinarily strict international controls, and very few facilities worldwide possess this capability. American and European enrichment facilities had controlled uranium transformation for decades, not just through economic advantages, but through controlling access to restricted technology that other nations simply did not possess. $50 billion made this control obsolete by acquiring enrichment technology through licensing from established operators, constructing facilities with capacity comparable to existing enrichment plants, and establishing supply relationships with reactor operators, seeking alternatives to concentrated enrichment supply. The control that had appeared permanent because it rested on restricted technology became obsolete when that technology was no longer restricted to established operators. The pattern repeated across every critical mineral where American facilities had controlled processing. $280 billion systematically made control obsolete by eliminating the structural advantages through which control had operated, not contesting American authority, not reducing American influence, making American processing structurally unnecessary to Canadian resource economics by creating equivalent alternatives that eliminated the rational economic basis for American control. The consequences of control becoming obsolete rather than contested are profound and permanent. Contested control can be reasserted if challengers fail or superior parties improve their competitive position. Obsolete control cannot be restored because the mechanisms through which it operated no longer function. Canadian lithium processing exists at scale and efficiency, making American processing unnecessary. That capacity will not be voluntarily eliminated to restore American control because doing so destroys asset value and abandons profitable operations. American processing companies recognize this obsolescence with remarkable clarity. Congressional testimony in late 2025 included statements acknowledging that Canadian competition had eliminated the necessity of American processing for Canadian materials. Lithium processors reported that Canadian producers no longer required American facilities to monetize their resources. Rare earth processors stated that Canadian operations offered customers equivalent alternatives to American supply. Uranium enrichment facilities acknowledged that Canadian capacity had broken the concentration that had sustained control. These testimonies documented not just the emergence of Canadian competition, but the obsolescence of American control. The necessity that had sustained voluntary compliance with American processing dominance had disappeared. Canadian materials no longer needed American transformation to achieve value. The control mechanisms that had operated automatically through economic rationality ceased functioning because economic rationality no longer favored American processing exclusively. I want to emphasize why obsolescence is categorically different from defeat, and why obsolete control cannot be restored through improved competitiveness. Defeat implies that superior capability was overcome by inferior capability through some combination of circumstances. Defeated parties can theoretically recover by improving their capabilities or exploiting competitor weaknesses. Obsolete control implies that capability itself, regardless of how superior, is no longer necessary because alternatives achieve equivalent outcomes through different mechanisms. American processing facilities retain their technical capabilities and could theoretically compete effectively against Canadian operations if competition were purely about operational excellence. But control was never purely about operational excellence. Control operated through being the only economically rational choice for Canadian materials. Once equivalent alternatives exist, operational excellence becomes insufficient to restore control because customers have options that did not exist when control was absolute. The permanence is reinforced by the dynamics of markets with multiple equivalent options. Canadian processors invest continuously in efficiency improvements to capture market share. American processors invest similarly to defend their positions. This competitive dynamic benefits customers through continuous innovation and cost reduction, while making restoration of singular control impossible, because both parties possess capabilities preventing the other from establishing dominance. The infrastructure that made American control obsolete exists independently of political decisions, and will continue operating as long as it remains economically viable. A rare earth processing facility in Quebec that cost billions to construct will not cease operations to restore American processing control, because doing so destroys asset value. The facility operates, serves customers, and ensures that American control remains obsolete regardless of political preferences in either nation. The expertise developed in Canadian processing operations persists in personnel who possess knowledge, making Canadian facilities progressively more competitive over time. Chemical engineers who perfected separation processes will not forget their expertise. Metallurgists who optimize production will not abandon their knowledge. This human capital accumulates and strengthens Canadian competitive position continuously, making restoration of American singular control progressively less feasible. Customer relationships established between Canadian processors and global manufacturers create dependencies that resist disruption. Battery companies that integrated Canadian lithium supply into production planning will not abandon those relationships without compelling reasons. Technology firms that depend on Canadian rare earth reliability will not switch back to American suppliers, whose control they accepted only when alternatives did not exist. These relationships represent sunk investments in supply chain integration that customers will not destroy to restore American processing control. The historical significance extends beyond economic relationships. This represents the first time in the post-war era that American control over a resource-rich nation's critical mineral processing has become obsolete through systematic construction of equivalent alternatives. Other nations had contested American processing dominance through incremental capacity additions or political confrontation. Canada made that dominance obsolete by building comprehensive alternatives at sufficient scale to eliminate the economic necessity that had sustained voluntary compliance with American control. For 80 years, American control over processing of Canadian critical minerals operated through economic rationality rather than political authority. Canadian materials passed through American facilities because doing so was the most economically rational choice given American advantages in capital, expertise, scale, and market access. That control appeared permanent because it operated through voluntary compliance based on rational economic calculation rather than coercion that could be resisted. $280 billion made that control obsolete by eliminating every structural advantage through which economic rationality favored American processing. Canadian facilities operate at equivalent scale, efficiency, technical capability, and market access. The economic calculation that had favored American processing for 80 years no longer produces the same result because equivalent alternatives exist within Canadian territory. American control has not been defeated in the sense that superior capability was overcome. American processing facilities retain their capabilities and continue operating effectively. But control has become obsolete in the sense that American processing is no longer necessary to Canadian resource economics. The mechanisms through which control operated, the absence of equivalent alternatives, making American processing the only economically rational choice, have been systematically eliminated. Obsolete control cannot be restored through competitive improvements because the problem is not inferior capability, but structural irrelevance. American facilities could become more efficient, reduce costs, improve quality, and enhance reliability without restoring control because Canadian alternatives exist at equivalent capability. The necessity that sustained control through voluntary compliance based on economic rationality no longer exists. Canadian materials achieve maximum value through Canadian processing, making American control structurally unnecessary regardless of American competitive capabilities. History will record that $280 billion made American control over processing of Canadian critical minerals obsolete. Not contested, not reduced. Obsolete. The control that had operated automatically for 80 years through economic rationality, favoring American processing, ceased functioning because the structural conditions that made American processing the only rational choice were systematically eliminated through construction of equivalent Canadian alternatives. The transformation is complete and irreversible, not because American capabilities have been defeated, but because American control has become structurally unnecessary. The mechanisms through which control operated no longer function, because the absence of alternatives that made control automatic has been replaced by presence of alternatives that make control obsolete. And obsolete control, by definition, cannot be restored because the structural conditions that made it operational no longer exist. What exists now is not American control contested by Canadian competition. What exists is obsolete American control that ceased functioning when Canadian alternatives eliminated the economic necessity that had sustained voluntary compliance for 80 years. The control is finished not because it was beaten, but because it became irrelevant. And irrelevance, once achieved through systematic elimination of the mechanisms enabling control, persists regardless of the capabilities or preferences of those whose control has become obsolete. By the time most people understand what occurred, the obsolescence will be so thoroughly established that questioning its permanence will appear absurd. This is how control ends permanently, not through defeat and competition, but through obsolescence, achieved by eliminating the structural conditions through which control operated. The 80-year American control over processing of Canadian critical minerals is obsolete. The mechanisms that enabled control no longer function. And mechanisms, once made structurally irrelevant through systematic construction of alternatives, do not resume operating simply because those who benefited from control wish they would.